You will not prevail! Face my power!
Status report. Enemy fleet?
Advancing, shields holding.
Deploy interceptors. Fire at will.
The void of space does not respect empires. It only respects mass gravity and the cold, hard laws of momentum. Ambassador Lerayan knew this better than anyone aboard the Pride of Valerius. At 68 years old, her bones carried the chill of a dozen different star systems, and her mind held the memories of 100 silent diplomatic wars. She stood at the edge of the sprawling observation deck, her hands clasped behind her back. Through the reinforced armor-glass, the stars burned like scattered diamonds against a canvas of absolute black. This was the frontier, the very edge of the Valaris Empire. Behind her lay 300 inhabited worlds, 1 trillion citizens, and a military machine that had not known defeat in 6 centuries. Before her lay the quiet, the unknown, the territory claimed by a relatively new, stubbornly silent species, humanity. For years, the Valaris High Council had watched the borders of human space. There were no grand broadcasts, no boastful displays of planetary engineering. Just a quiet, invisible line drawn in the dark and an eerie silence that frustrated the younger, hotter bloods in the Valaris military. But today the silence would end. Today the Empire would dictate the terms of reality. The diplomatic package is compiled, Ambassador, a voice called out from the shadows of the command trench. Liren turned slowly. The deck of the Pride of Valerius was a masterpiece of intimidating architecture. Vaulted ceilings, polished obsidian floors, and the low predatory hum of the ship's antimatter core vibrating through the soles of her boots. At the primary science console sat Director Thalor. His pale, narrow face was illuminated by the glow of a dozen holographic displays. He was a creature of data, a man who worshipped at the altar of statistics. "Confirm the contents, Director," Liren said. Her voice was quiet, yet it carried across the cavernous room with the weight of absolute authority. Thalor's fingers danced across the hard light keys. 40,000 terabytes of data, translation matrices in 17 dialects. A complete history of Valaris benevolence. The proposed border demarcations, the trade restrictions, and the mutual protection clauses. Liren closed her eyes for a brief moment. She knew what was actually in that package. It was not a negotiation. It was a gilded page. It was a masterpiece of diplomatic subjugation crafted by the High Council over 3 agonizing months. It offered these humans protection in exchange for their autonomy. It demanded their raw materials at pennies on the dollar. It was the same treaty the Empire had used to quietly swallow 6 younger species. "It is a heavy burden we place upon them," Liren murmured. Heavy footsteps echoed against the obsidian floor. Commander Vorgas stepped into the light of the observation deck. He was a mountain of a man clad in the sleek, dark armor of the Valaris security fleet. He moved with the restless, aggressive energy of a predator that had been kept in a cage for too long. "It is the burden of civilization, Ambassador," Vorgath rumbled. His voice was thick with the arrogance of a generation that had never seen a peer-to-peer conflict. "These humans are primitives. They hide in their little pocket of space because they know what lies beyond. We are doing them a favor by bringing them into the fold. If they resist, my railgun batteries will happily explain the mathematics of Valaris superiority." Lorraine looked at the commander. She saw the fire in his eyes. It was a fire she recognized from the history books, from the old days before the Empire stabilized. It was the dangerous pride of a man who believed that having the biggest gun meant having the greatest wisdom. "We are here to conquer with ink, Commander Vorgath," Liren said coldly. "Not with tungsten. A fired weapon is a failure of statecraft." Vorgath sneered, though he kept his head bowed in a mockery of respect. "As you say, Ambassador." Liren turned back to the viewport. She felt a phantom ache in her joints. The old instincts, the quiet whisper in the back of her mind that said something about this sector of space was fundamentally wrong. "Director Thalor," Liren commanded, "transmit the package. Maximum broadcast power. Let the humans know the Valaris Empire is at their door." "Transmitting," Thalor replied. A low thrum resonated through the hull as the ship's primary communication array dumped the massive data packet into the void. It was a wave of information so dense it would temporarily blind any primitive sensor buoys in the area. Transmission complete, Thalor confirmed. Routing through the translation matrix, we should expect a parsing delay on their end. Given their projected technological baseline, it will take them at least 2 months to decrypt the linguistics and another month to formulate a political response. I will place the comms array in standby. Thalor's voice died in his throat. The silence on the bridge became absolute. The only sound was the deep, rhythmic heartbeat of the ship's reactor. Director Liren asked, not turning around. Thalor was staring at his console. His face had drained of all color. His hands hovered over the keys, trembling slightly. Ambassador, Thalor whispered. We have a response. Vorgath let out a harsh bark of laughter. Impossible, an automated receipt, perhaps. A bounce back from a dead relay. No, Thalor said, his voice tightening. It is a direct response, originating from deep within human space. The encryption handshake was bypassed completely. Laraine finally turned. The phantom ache in her joints flared into a cold spike of dread. How long? Thalor swallowed hard. 17 seconds. 17 seconds. The words hung in the air like a physical weight. It was impossible. It took longer than 17 seconds for a signal to bounce from the outer hull to the ship's internal servers. To receive a 40,000 terabyte diplomatic package, decrypt it, translate it, run it through a chain of command, and formulate a response in 17 seconds. It defied the laws of computation. It defied the laws of bureaucracy. Put it on the main display, Liren ordered. Her voice remained steady, but her heart had begun a slow, heavy pounding against her ribs. The massive holographic projector in the center of the command trench flared to life. Liren braced herself. She expected to see a human face, a panicked leader, a military general shouting defiance. She expected to see a chaotic scramble of a lesser species, realizing a god had just knocked on their door. The projector displayed a single line of text, white glowing characters against the dark. No diplomatic greetings, no cultural pleasantries, no acknowledgement of the Valaris Empire, the High Council, or the treaty. It was a string of numbers, spatial coordinates, and below it a timestamp, a countdown, 71, 59, 59. That's it, Vorgath demanded, stepping forward, his heavy boots slamming against the deck. Is the rest of the file corrupted? Where is the video feed? Where is the surrender? The file is pristine, Commander. Thalor set his fingers flying across the console, desperate to find hidden data that simply wasn't there. It's exactly 3.2 kilobytes. It is nothing but raw locational data and a chronometer. The coordinates point to a sector of dead space 14 light-years inside their claimed territory. Liren stared at the glowing numbers. The countdown ticked down. 71, 59, 51. 71, 59, 50. It was not a message. It was a summons. This is an insult, Vorgath snarled. His hand instinctively dropped to the heavy sidearm strapped to his thigh. 3 months of council preparation, the greatest diplomatic offer in the history of this quadrant, and they answer with a map reference. They treat us like cargo haulers, like delivery boys. They treat us with exact precision, Liren murmured, her eyes locked on the ticking clock. It's a trap, Vorgath insisted. He turned to the tactical console. We are sitting on their border. They want to draw the pride of Valerius into a kill box. I recommend we reverse course hold at the perimeter and bombard the coordinates from maximum range until they learn how to speak with respect. You will do no such thing, Commander, Liren snapped. The sudden venom in her voice caused Vorgath to flinch. She stepped down into the command trench, her posture rigid, her aura commanding absolute obedience. You look at those numbers and you see an insult, Vorgath, because your pride is fragile. I look at those numbers and I see a lack of fear. I see a species that does not need 3 months to debate their survival. They do not need to read our 40,000 pages of threats. Liren pointed a slender, gloved finger at the display. They knew we were coming. They knew what we were going to say before we even sent it. That is a tactical impossibility. Ambassador, Thalor interjected, ever the slave to his data. Our stealth protocols on the approach were flawless. Our encryption is unbreakable. Clearly, Director, it is not, Lorraine said quietly. She stared at the coordinates. It felt like looking down the barrel of a loaded weapon, a weapon held by someone with a very steady hand. Set a course for the coordinates, Lorraine ordered. Ambassador, I must protest, Vorgath began. Your protest is logged, Commander. Set the course. We have an invitation. We would be poor guests to be late. As the bridge crew scrambled to input the navigation data, Lyrian turned back to the observation window. The Pride of Valeria slowly banked its massive thrusters, flaring in the dark, reorienting the billion-ton Leviathan toward the heart of human space. Behind her in the dim light of the tactical station, Commander Vorgath stood rigid. His jaw was clenched so tight the muscles twitched beneath his skin. He watched the old woman staring out at the stars. He hated her caution. He hated her fear. The Valaris Empire did not walk blindly into the dark. The Valaris Empire brought the fire. Vorgath turned his back to the ambassador. He shielded his hands from view and pulled a sleek black data slate from his utility belt. It was hardwired to the ship's emergency tight beam array, bypassing diplomatic oversight entirely. His fingers moved rapidly, inputting a code known only to the highest echelons of the security fleet. Code Black. Diplomatic escort compromised. Hostile intent assumed. Bring the hammer. He appended the human coordinates to the message and hit send. A microscopic, invisible pulse of tachyonic energy shot out from the rear of the ship, tearing a hole through subspace. It raced back toward Valaris space, toward the shadows of a nearby nebula, where 50 heavily armored strike cruisers sat in silent reserve, waiting for the leash to be cut. Vorgath holstered the slate. He felt a cold satisfaction settle in his chest. Let the old woman play her games of diplomacy. Let her read the tea leaves and fear the silence. When the humans tried to spring their little trap, they would find themselves crushed beneath the treads of the greatest military machine in the galaxy. He walked back to his station. The countdown on the main screen ticked away relentlessly. 71, 45, 12. The journey into the human sector was a study in psychological torture. For 3 days, the Pride of Valerius cut through the void. For 3 days, the bridge crew operated in a state of hypervigilance. Every active sensor was pushed to maximum gain. Every passive listening array was tuned to catch the slightest whisper of radiation, the faintest ghost of an engine trail. There was nothing. The space was dead. No merchant lanes, no automated mining drones, no navigational buoys, just the cold, indifferent stars and the absolute black of the interstellar medium. Lyran barely slept. She spent her hours sitting in the command chair watching the countdown. The silence of the human sector felt heavy. It didn't feel like the emptiness of an uninhabited region. It felt like a held breath. It reminded her of her youth. It reminded her of the great standoff decades ago, when the Empire had almost annihilated itself in a civil war. She remembered sitting in the deep-crust bunkers, staring at radar screens, knowing that somewhere out there in the dark, nuclear submarines were drifting silently through the oceans, waiting for a single sound to unleash Armageddon. That was the feeling of swimming in water you knew was occupied by leviathans, even if you couldn't see the fins. Status Director Thalor, Lyran asked. Her voice was slightly hoarse. It was the 48th hour. No anomalies, Ambassador, Thalor replied, rubbing his bloodshot eyes. He had consumed enough chemical stimulants to kill a lesser man. Background radiation is completely flat. No thermal blooms, no gravity wells. The target coordinates remain completely devoid of matter. And the communications band, silent. Since the initial pulse, there has been no electronic traffic of any kind. They aren't even scanning us. They don't need to, Lorraine whispered. Vorgath paced the deck like a caged predator. They are hiding. They know we are coming, and they are hiding behind a moon or buried in an asteroid field. There are no moons, Commander, Thalor sighed. There are no asteroids. There is no dust. It is empty space. Then it is a bluff, Vorgath spat. A pathetic, primitive bluff meant to make us nervous. Lyrain did not answer. She just watched the clock. 12 o'clock, 5 o'clock, 1 o'clock. The final hour was the longest. The hum of the ship's engines seemed to grow louder, amplifying the tension on the bridge. The crew spoke in hushed whispers, terrified of breaking the silence. Lyrain stood from her chair and walked down to the main viewport. She smoothed the front of her diplomatic tunic. She ensured her posture was perfect. She was a daughter of Valaris. She would face whatever was out there with the dignity of her ancestors. Approaching target coordinates, the navigation officer called out. His voice cracked slightly. Dropping out of warp. Now, the stars beyond the viewport stretched from long streaks of white light back into pinpricks of fire. The deep, bone-rattling vibration of the warp drive spooled down into a quiet hum. The Pride of Valerius slid into real space, its massive engines firing retro bursts to kill its momentum. Relative velocity is 0, navigation reported. We have arrived at the exact coordinates. Lorraine looked out the window. There was nothing. Just the black. Just the stars. Sensors director, Laren commanded. Thalor's hands flew across his console. The holographic displays flashed rapidly, processing billions of data points a second. Active sweeps are clear, Thalor said. His voice was laced with profound confusion. Passive listening is clear. Radar, lidar, thermal graviton. All clear. I have swept a radius of 1 million kilometers. Expand the sweep, Vorgath ordered, stepping forward. Maximum range. They have to be here. Sweeping at 5 million kilometers, Thalor said. The sweat was beading on his pale forehead. Nothing. The sector is dead. We are entirely alone. The great countdown clock in the center of the room hit 0. 00000. The digits blinked and then vanished. The silence on the bridge was deafening. Vorgath let out a long, slow breath. He began to laugh. It was a harsh, ugly sound. A bluff, the commander sneered. A cowardly, pathetic bluff. They sent us a dead coordinate to buy themselves time. They are probably evacuating their border worlds right now, fleeing like vermin before the light. He turned to Lorraine, a triumphant smirk on his face. This is your great mystery ambassador. Empty space. I told you they were primitives. They don't even have the courage to show up to their own ambush. Lorraine ignored him. Her heart was in her throat. Her instincts were screaming at her. The ache in her bones was an agony now. You do not answer a god with a coordinate unless you are a bigger god. Director Thalor, Lyron said softly. Check the quantum vacuum states. Thalor paused. Ambassador, quantum vacuum monitoring is for theoretical physics, not naval navigation. It requires do it, Thalor, now. Thalor swallowed hard. He rerouted the ship's primary computing core dumping power from the life support redundancies into the deepest, most sensitive sensor arrays the Empire possessed. The holographic projector flickered. Then Thalor gasped. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated terror. Ambassador? Thalor choked out. His hands were trembling so violently he could barely hold on to the console. The vacuum, the quantum states, they aren't flat. Explain, Lyran demanded, her blood running cold. There are mass distortions, Thalor whispered. Massive ones, sitting right on top of us. They aren't registering on thermal or radar because they aren't emitting energy. They are absorbing it, all of it. Vorgath stopped laughing. He lunged toward the console, where I don't see anything on the tactical grid, because they aren't in normal space. Thalor screamed, his composure shattering entirely. They are sitting in the quantum shadow. They're phasing, and they are gods of the abyss. They are massive. How many? Laren asked. The world seemed to slow down. Thalor looked up from his screen. His eyes were wide, white, and full of a terrible realization. 47, Thalor breathed, surrounding us in a perfect sphere. Distance 200 kilometers. They are right outside the window. Lorraine turned back to the viewport. The stars began to blink out, not one by one, but in massive, jagged patches. It was as if a great black curtain was being drawn across the universe. The absolute dark of the void was shifting, rippling like water, disturbed by the rising of a leviathan. The darkness peeled back, and the monsters showed their faces. It was not a sudden burst of light. It was a slow, agonizing slide of reality. The void itself seemed to shed a layer of dead skin. Where there had been empty space, there was now geometry, brutal utilitarian geometry. They were not elegant. The vessels of the Valaris Empire were designed with sweeping arcs and gilded fins built to project the glory and artistry of a supreme culture. The human ships were built to kill. They were vast, jagged monoliths of matched black armor that drank the starlight. There were no glowing energy fields, no decorative luminescence. They looked like slabs of forged iron torn from the core of a dead world. Running along the dorsal spine of each colossal vessel were the magnetic acceleration coils of mass drivers, railguns so massive they defied Valaris engineering principles. Scale, Lorraine choked out. Her voice was barely a whisper, but in the dead silence of the bridge, it sounded like a scream. Primary contact is, Thalor stammered. He was weeping. He did not realize it, but tears were streaming down his pale cheeks. Length is 32 kilometers. Mass is, it registers as a planetary body ambassador, and there are 47 of them. They are maintaining a perfectly spherical envelope around us. Distance is locked at 200 kilometers. Vorgath's face was a mask of rigid primal terror. The swagger was gone. The predator had realized it was locked in a cage with a monster. Shields, Vorgath roared, his voice cracking. Full power to forward deflectors. Spool up the plasma lances. Target the nearest vessel. Commander, no, Lirai shouted, stepping forward. They have us surrounded. It's an ambush. Vorgath slammed his hand onto the tactical console. We fire first. We break the line and jump to warp. Weapons are offline, the tactical officer screamed from the lower trench. Targeting systems cannot achieve a lock. Their hulls, the radar is just sliding off them. They have no thermal signature. We can't lock on. Manual targeting, fire the lances, Vorgath bellowed. Vorgath, stand down. Lorraine's voice echoed with the absolute authority of the High Council. She grabbed the commander by the arm. His muscles were tight as coiled steel. Look at them. Look at the size of their guns. If you fire a plasma lance, it will barely scratch their paint. In return, they will put a slug of solid metal through this ship at a fraction of the speed of light. We will not be a casualty. We will be dust. Vorgath stared at the massive black shapes looming in the viewport. His chest heaved. The reality of the kinetic disparity was crashing down upon him. He was a man who understood firepower, and he was currently looking at enough firepower to crack a continent in half. He slowly pulled his hand away from the firing console. They were right on top of us, Thaler whispered, wiping his face. For 3 days, they matched our velocity. They matched our vector. We dragged them with us in our own wake, and our sensors didn't hear a single whisper. The energy required to maintain a quantum stealth field of that magnitude, it is godlike. Not God's director, Liren said, forcing herself to stand tall. Her knees were shaking, but she locked them into place. Just very, very quiet professionals. The ship's communication array chirped. It was a soft, melodic sound. It cut through the panic on the bridge like a scalpel. Origin point, Liren asked. Omnidirectional. Thaler replied, his hands shaking over the keys. It is bypassing our encryption entirely. They are simply injecting the audio directly into our internal broadcast system. Audio only. Liren took a deep breath. She smoothed her tunic one last time. Put it through. A voice filled the bridge. It was not the booming synthesized voice of a warlord. It was not a chorus of religious zealots. It was the voice of an older woman. Calm, measured, utterly devoid of aggression or fear. It sounded like a school teacher asking for quiet in a classroom. Valaris diplomatic vessel, Pride of Valerius. This is Ambassador Alden of the Terran Diplomatic Corps, broadcasting from the heavy cruiser Silent Watch. We apologize for the abrupt visual transition. Quantum phase deceleration can be disconcerting to unshielded optics. Lorraine stared at the audio visualizer on the main screen. The voice was perfectly translated, carrying nuances of respect and absolute control. Please inform your tactical officer to power down his plasma lance preheaters. Ambassador Alden continued, her tone conversational. They are running 12 degrees above optimal safety tolerances, and we would hate for you to suffer an internal containment breach. You are in no danger from us, Ambassador Leroyan. We are simply here to talk. Vorgath stepped back as if he had been struck. He looked at the tactical officer, who nodded frantically, confirming that the plasma preheaters were indeed running exactly 12 degrees too hot. They were inside the ship's systems. They were reading the dials on their engines from 200 kilometers away. Ambassador Alden, Liren said, her voice steady, projecting a calm she did not feel. I am Lyrian of the Valaris High Council. We acknowledge your presence. Your arrival was unexpected. We find that visual context is necessary before discussing matters of border security. Alden replied smoothly. Documents can be debated, Ambassador. Tonnage cannot. I am currently in a transit shuttle. I am requesting permission to board your vessel to discuss the terms of our coexistence. A shuttle, not a demand to surrender. A polite request to board. Liren's mind raced. The protocol of the Cold War. You do not panic when the enemy surfaces their submarine next to your battleship. You invite the captain for tea, and you measure the size of his torpedo tubes. Permission granted, Ambassador Alden, Liren said. We will clear docking bay 4. Unnecessary, Alden replied. We prefer not to trouble your hangar crews. I will meet you on your observation deck in 3 seconds. 3 sec, Thaler started. A sharp crack of displaced air echoed through the bridge. The security detail instantly raised their rifles. Vorgath drew his heavy sidearm, aiming it at the center of the room. There was no flash of light, no swirling vortex of energy, just a sudden drop in air pressure, and 3 figures were standing on the polished obsidian floor of the command trench. Liren raised a hand signaling the guards to hold their fire. Ambassador Alden of Terra was small. She stood perhaps a head shorter than Liren. She wore a sharply tailored dark gray uniform with no medals, no rank insignia, and no decorative flair. Her hair was silver, pulled back into a tight, practical knot. Her hands were clasped in front of her. Flanking her were 2 heavily armored figures. They wore completely enclosed matte black hazard suits. They carried no visible firearms. They stood with their hands resting easily at their sides, their posture relaxed but radiating an intense cold readiness. Alden looked around the massive bridge. Her eyes took in the vaulted ceilings, the panicked crew, the heavy weapons pointed at her chest. Her expression did not change. There was no awe. There was no fear. She looked at the guns the way a mechanic looks at a rusted wrench. Ambassador Liren, Alden said, offering a crisp, shallow bow. Thank you for accommodating us on such short notice. Liren stepped forward, ignoring the frantic whispers of Vorgath behind her. She looked down at the human woman. She felt the sudden crushing weight of history shifting on its axis. You bypass our shields, Liren said, keeping her voice even. You phase through solid matter. You surround a sovereign diplomatic vessel with an armada. This is an act of war, Ambassador Alden. Alden offered a faint, polite smile. It did not reach her eyes. Her eyes were like chips of glacial ice. If this were an act of war, Ambassador Liren, you would not have seen us, Alden said quietly. You would not have heard us. You simply would have ceased to exist. This is not war. This is a handshake. We are establishing the parameters of our conversation. You sent us coordinates, Vorgath snarled, stepping up beside Liren, his weapon still drawn but angled toward the floor. You ignored our transmission. You ignored our treaty. Alden slowly turned her head to look at Vorgath. She studied him for a long moment. Commander Vorgath, Alden said, Chief of Security for the 3rd Expansion Fleet, graduated top of your class at the Valerius Naval Academy. You favor aggressive close-quarters plasma barrages. You have a scar on your left shoulder from a shrapnel wound during the subjugation of the Kaelin systems 12 years ago. Vorgath's jaw dropped. His grip on his pistol faltered. How? We read your treaty, Ambassador, Alden said, turning her attention back to Liren. She casually ignored the massive commander. All 40,000 pages of it. It was beautifully written. A masterpiece of legal entrapment. You offered us access to your trade routes in exchange for a 70% tariff on our raw materials. You offered us military protection in exchange for the dismantling of our orbital shipyards. You offered us a car painted gold. Liren felt a flush of heat in her cheeks. The shame of being exposed, of having her empire's cynical tactics laid bare by a species she had deemed primitive. It was a starting point for negotiations. Liren countered smoothly, falling back on decades of training. We assumed you were a young species. We sought to provide stability. We do not require stability, Ambassador, Alden said. We manufacture it. Alden reached into the pocket of her tunic. Instantly, a dozen Valaris rifles snapped up the distinctive whine of plasma coils filling the room. The 2 armored humans flanking Alden did not flinch. They did not reach for weapons. They simply shifted their weight, angling their bodies slightly to place themselves between the rifles and their ambassador. Alden moved slowly, deliberately. She pulled a small, black, rectangular device from her pocket and placed it on the command console. "Stand down," Larian ordered her guards. The whine of the rifles died away. "This is a localized data spool," Aldous explained. "It contains our counter-proposal. It is entirely isolated. It contains no malicious code, no virals, no tracking software. I invite Director Thaler to scan it before opening." Thaler, still pale and sweating, ran a handheld scanner over the device. He nodded weakly to Larian. "It's clean, standard binary architecture, very simple." "Play it on the main display, Director," Larian ordered him. Thaler plugged the spool into the console. The holographic projector above the trench shifted. The coordinates vanished. Instead, a highly detailed three-dimensional star map appeared. It showed the Valaris Empire. 300 star systems marked in blue. Then it showed the human territory. It was not the small, isolated pocket of space the High Council had estimated. The human border stretched out like a massive, jagged scythe wrapping around the eastern flank of the Valaris Empire, encompassing thousands of dead, resource-rich systems the Valaris had never bothered to scan. "You have been expanding," Larian murmured, her eyes tracing the massive borderline. "In the dark, without a single broadcast. We prefer not to make noise until we are ready to speak," Alden said. The display shifted again. It zoomed in on the Valaris capital world of Valerius Prime. A list of text began to scroll rapidly next to the spinning blue globe. Larian read the first few lines and felt the breath leave her lungs. It was a list of names, the names of the High Council members. Below each name was a detailed psychological profile. Their financial holdings, their secret alliances, their mistresses, their medical records. The display shifted again. It showed the Valaris First Fleet currently docked at the homeworld shipyards. It listed the exact yield of their plasma warheads, the maintenance schedules of their engines, the names of the captains, the structural flaws in their starboard armor plating. "Director Thaler," Larian whispered, her voice trembling. "Is this data accurate?" Thaler was staring at the screen, his mouth open in silent horror. He keyed in a few commands, cross-referencing the human data with their own deeply encrypted military servers. It is flawlessly accurate, Ambassador," Thaler choked out. "They have structural schematics for ships we haven't even finished in building yet." "How?" Vorgath demanded. His voice was raw, stripped of all arrogance. "How did you get this?" "We have monitored our borders for a century. No scout ship could have penetrated our network. No spy could have gathered this much." Alden clasped her hands behind her back. For the first time, a hint of steel entered her voice. "You are thinking like a conqueror, Commander Vorgath," Alden said. "You think of borders as lines on a map to be crossed with guns and flags. We think of borders as permeable membranes. We did not send scout ships. We sent algorithms. We sent passive listening posts no larger than a grain of sand drifting on solar winds. We tapped your deep space comm relays before your grandfathers were born." Alden stepped closer to Larian. The human ambassador smelled of sterile ozone and cold tea. "We have been watching you, Larian," Alden said softly, "for 200 years. We watched you subjugate the Kalan. We watched you burn the atmospheric processors of the Morax. We listened to your High Council debate whether to enslave us or eradicate us." Larian felt a profound existential chill settle into her bones. 200 years. While the Valaris Empire strutted across the stars, believing themselves the masters of the universe, this species had been sitting in the dark taking notes. Patient, silent, calculating. It was the ultimate intelligence superiority. It was a Cold War waged entirely by one side, while the other side didn't even know the game had begun. "If you have known all this," Larian asked, her voice tight, "if you have had this advantage for centuries, why have you not attacked? Why wait until we sent a message?" "Because we are not monsters, Ambassador," Alden replied. "We do not strike preemptively. We believe in the rule of law. We believe in giving our neighbors the opportunity to choose peace. We waited until you knocked on our door, and when you did, you brought a cage." Alden gestured to the holographic display. The screen wiped clean. A new document appeared. It was written in flawless Valaris high script. "This is the Treaty of the Orion Spur," Alden said. "It is our counter-proposal." Larian stepped up to the console and began to read. She expected a demand for unconditional surrender. She expected reparations, territorial concessions, the dismantling of the Valaris military. Instead, she saw a trade agreement. It was perfectly balanced. It offered the Valaris access to advanced human material sciences in exchange for agricultural exports. It established a rigid, demilitarized neutral zone between their borders. It contained a mutual non-aggression pact. It was the most generous, equitable treaty Lorraine had ever seen in her 50 years of diplomatic service. She looked up at Alden, completely bewildered. "I don't understand," Lorraine said. "You have us completely outmatched. You have our tactical data. You have a fleet of titans surrounding us. You could demand our subjugation. You could turn our worlds to glass. Why are you offering us equal terms?" Alden's eyes hardened. The polite facade dropped, revealing the immense, terrible discipline beneath. "Because we know what happens when you corner an empire," Alden said, her voice dropping to a low, resonant register. "We have lived through the ashes of total war on our own world. We know the cost of arrogance. We do not want your worlds, Lyraean. We do not want your citizens as slaves. We want quiet neighbors." Alden leaned forward slightly. "We are offering you this treaty not out of weakness, but out of absolute unshakable strength. We are offering you a fair deal because we want you to prosper. But understand this, it is not a negotiation. It is a boundary. You will respect it. You will stay on your side of the line. You will not spy, you will not probe, and you will not test our resolve." Lyran stared at the human. She realized she was not looking at a diplomat. She was looking at a warden who had just handed the inmates a set of rules backed by the threat of overwhelming disciplined violence. "And if we refuse?" Vorgath asked, his voice a low growl. Alden did not look at him. She kept her eyes locked on Lorraine. "You will not refuse, Ambassador," Alden said calmly, "because you are a rational woman. But if the hot-blooded elements of your military decide to ignore your wisdom—" Alden paused. "Then we will educate them." The silence that followed Alden's words was heavy, suffocating. Larian felt the truth of the statement settling into her bones. Education. It was the calm certainty in the human's voice that terrified her the most. It was the tone of a disciplinarian who had already calculated the exact amount of force required to correct a misbehaving child. Before Lorraine could formulate a response, the command deck of the Pride of Valerius erupted into a cacophony of blaring klaxons. The primary tactical holographic projector shifted from the treaty document to a frantic wash of crimson threat indicators. Director Thalor practically fell over his console, his hands scrambling across the keys as he tried to process the sudden influx of data. "Ambassador!" Thalor shrieked, his voice breaking. Multiple warp signatures, massive subspace displacement detected at the perimeter of the human sphere. Lyran's blood ran cold. She spun around to face Vorgath. The commander had backed away from the human delegation. His hand was no longer hovering near his sidearm. It was firmly resting on the hilt. A cruel, triumphant smile had spread across his heavy features. The fear from moments ago had vanished, replaced by the intoxicating rush of impending violence. "I told you they were cowards, Lyraean," Vorgath sneered, dropping all pretense of diplomatic rank. "You let them talk you into a corner. You let them scare you with their parlor tricks and their stolen data. But raw data doesn't win wars. Firepower does." "What have you done?" Lorraine demanded, stepping toward him, her voice trembling with a mixture of rage and profound horror. "I sent a code black before we crossed the border," Vorgath stated proudly. "I summoned the 5th Vanguard Reserve, 50 heavy strike cruisers. They tracked our warp wake. They are dropping into real space right now." Through the massive armor-glass viewport, the void of space tore open. 50 jagged terrors in the fabric of reality flared with blinding blue light. Out of the warp rifts poured the pride of the Valaris military machine. They were sleek, predatory vessels, plated in gleaming silver and gold armor, their plasma engines burning with the intensity of captured stars. They moved in perfect, aggressive formation, a spearhead aimed directly at the massive, silent black hulls of the human fleet. "Vorgath, you utter fool!" Lorraine screamed, her diplomatic composure shattering entirely. "You have just signed the death warrant of our entire empire." "I am securing our borders," Vorgath roared back. He tapped his communicator bead. "Vanguard Actual, this is Commander Vorgath. The diplomatic envoy has been taken hostage by a hostile force. You are clear to engage. Break their line. Burn them to slag. Liren turned back to Ambassador Alden. She expected the human to panic. She expected the two armored guards to draw their weapons and take her hostage. She expected demands, threats, or, at the very least, an emergency teleportation back to their own ship. Alden simply sighed. It was a quiet, weary sound. The sound of an old mechanic listening to an engine knock, knowing exactly how much it was going to cost to fix it. I had hoped, Alden said softly, looking at the tactical display, where the 50 Valaris cruisers were already charging their weapons, that your age had brought your people wisdom Leroen. But it seems you still let your children play with matches. Ambassador Alden, please, Lerayan pleaded, stepping between the human and the window. I did not authorize this. The High Council did not authorize this. It is a rogue action by a fractured military command. Give me time to countermand his orders. The time for talking expired the moment his ships armed their primary batteries. Alden said. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. Commander Vorgath believes in the supremacy of energy weapons. He believes in plasma and heat and light. He is about to learn a very old, very terrestrial lesson in Newtonian physics. Alden glanced at her bare wrist, though she wore no watch. Brace your ship, Ambassador. Outside the viewport, the Valaris Vanguard fleet opened fire. 50 capital-grade plasma lances ignited simultaneously. The sheer luminescence of the volley automatically triggered the polarization filters on the Pride of Valerius's windows, plunging the bridge into artificial twilight. Beams of superheated electromagnetically contained stellar matter struck the matte black hulls of the human dreadnoughts. It was an attack that would have melted the crust of a small moon. The plasma splashed against the black armor of the human ships. And then, it simply dissipated. There were no explosive shockwaves, no shattered armor plating, no venting oxygen. The colossal black monoliths absorbed the thermal energy like a sponge absorbing water. The heat sinks on their dorsal ridges glowed a faint dull red for a fraction of a second, and then faded back to absolute black. Vorgath's triumphant smile froze. Impossible. Their shields, they didn't even raise shields. They don't use shields, Commander. Thalor whimpered from his console, his eyes glued to the telemetry. It's a blade of metamaterial. It's completely non-reactive. The plasma, it just washed over them. Then fire again, Vorgath screamed into his comms. Maximum yield, overload the reactors if you have to. They will not get the chance, Alden said. Along the spine of the nearest human dreadnought, the massive magnetic acceleration coils began to hum. It was not a sound that could be heard in the vacuum of space, but Lyraean could feel it. A deep, bone-rattling vibration that resonated through the deck plates, a frequency that made her teeth ache. There were no glowing lasers, no dramatic charging sequences, just the brutal, invisible application of kinetic energy. The human ship fired. A slug of solid tungsten carbide weighing roughly 50 metric tons was accelerated out of the mass driver at 0.04%, the speed of light. It crossed the 200-kilometer gap in a microsecond. The human weapon did not rely on heat or explosive yield. It relied purely on mass times velocity. It was a kinetic penetrator, a bullet scaled up to the size of a building driven by the wrath of a restrained god. It struck the lead Valaris strike cruiser dead center. The Valaris deflector shields designed to absorb energy weapons and plasma were completely useless against raw, unyielding mass. The tungsten slug punched through the shielding as if it were wet tissue paper. It tore through the gleaming silver armor, shattered the internal bulkheads, and ripped straight through the engineering deck. It did not stop. The slug exited the rear of the cruiser, dragging a horrific plume of shattered metal and venting atmosphere behind it. With its momentum barely checked, the tungsten rod slammed into the cruiser, flying in formation directly behind the first. It cored the second ship with the same brutal efficiency, tearing through its propulsion manifolds. Still, it did not stop. The slug struck a third cruiser, finally embedding itself deep within the vessel's titanium superstructure, its kinetic energy dissipating in a massive silent shockwave that buckled the ship's spine in half. 3 top-tier Valaris warships, neutralized in less than a heartbeat, by a single bullet. On the bridge of the Pride of Valerius, there was only a stunned, horrified silence. Director Liren whispered, her throat dry. Casualty report. Thalor's hands hovered over the console. He looked like a man who had just watched the universe end. I, I'm reading Life Signs Ambassador. Thousands of them. The human weapon, it didn't hit the antimatter containment cells on any of the three ships. Lyrian frowned, confusion piercing through her terror. A lucky trajectory. No, Alden corrected her. The human ambassador was staring out the window, her hands still clasped behind her back. We do not rely on luck. The targeting trajectory was calculated to sever the primary plasma conduits, cripple the sublight engines, and disable the weapons arrays. We deliberately plotted a course that bypassed the crew quarters and the reactor cores. Vorgath stumbled backward, his back hitting the coal bulkhead. He looked at the tactical screen. The three crippled cruisers were drifting aimlessly, their power grids dark, their weapons silent. They were dead in the water, but the crews were alive. You missed the reactors on purpose. Vorgath breathed, his voice hollow. It was the realization of a predator, discovering that the creature it was hunting was actually a zookeeper. We fight like demons, Commander Vorgath, Alden said, turning her glacial eyes upon him. But we protect like angels. We have no desire to slaughter your sailors. They are simply following the orders of a very foolish man. Outside the window, the rest of the human fleet shifted. 47 mass drivers slowly swiveled, locking onto the remaining 47 Valaris cruisers. The magnetic coils began to hum a low vibration that promised the immediate kinetic disassembly of the entire Vanguard fleet. Commander Alden said, her voice echoing in the dead silence of the bridge. You have exactly 10 seconds to order your fleet to power down their weapons and surrender their navigational control. If you do not, I will authorize a full kinetic barrage. We will not be aiming for the engines this time. Vorgath looked at Lyrian. The commander's eyes were wide, pleading. The arrogance had been stripped away, leaving only a terrified, broken soldier who had finally realized the true scale of the galaxy. Do it, Vorgath, Lyrian commanded, her voice ringing with absolute unyielding authority. Or I will execute you myself for high treason against the Empire. Vorgath's hand trembled as he reached for his communicator. Vanguard Actual, power down all weapons. Dump the plasma cores. Surrender navigational telemetry. We yield. On the tactical display, the crimson threat indicators slowly turned gray. The Valaris fleet, the pride of the Empire, sat dead in space, entirely at the mercy of the silent black monoliths surrounding them. Alden nodded once. She tapped a discreet earpiece. Fleet Command, this is Alden. Stand down, main batteries. Target lock achieved. The classroom is secure. The deep vibration of the magnetic coils faded away. Lyrian felt her legs give out. She leaned heavily against the command console, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She had just witnessed the complete dismantling of Valaris military doctrine in less than 2 minutes. It wasn't just a defeat, it was a surgical dissection. Ambassador Lorraine, Alden said, stepping forward. She picked up the small, black data spool containing the treaty and held it out. Your government requires raw materials, Alden said, her voice returning to its calm, measured tone. We have them. Your people require agricultural stability. We can provide it. In exchange, you will remain on your side of the border. You will not expand into our territory. You will not engage in espionage against our assets. And you will never, ever point a weapon at a human vessel again. Lyrain reached out with a trembling hand and took the data spool. It felt heavier than a star. You could have destroyed us, Lyrain whispered, looking deep into the human's eyes. 200 years of watching. You could have dismantled our empire from the inside out. Why? Because we are old, Lyran, Alden said softly. As a species, we have outgrown the need to conquer. We have survived our own nuclear fires. We have survived our own arrogance. When you live as long as we have, when you see as much as we have seen, you realize that the universe does not need another tyrant. Alden gestured toward the window, toward the drifting Valaris ships and the silent human dreadnoughts. We are not here to rule you. We are here to ensure you survive long enough to grow up. The treaty is fair. Sign it, take your broken ships, and go home. Tell your High Council what you saw here today. Alden bowed exactly as she had when she arrived. A crisp, shallow, highly professional gesture. Without another word, the drop in air pressure returned. The human ambassador and her 2 silent guards vanished, phasing back into the quantum shadows from whence they came. Lyran stood alone in the command trench. The silence of the bridge was absolute. Vorgath was still slumped against the bulkhead. Theor was weeping quietly into his hands. Liren looked down at the black spool in her hand. She did not feel the humiliation of defeat. She felt the sudden crushing weight of clarity. They were not negotiating with equals. They were being spared by giants. 17 days later, Valerius Prime, the High Council chambers. The architecture of the chamber was designed to intimidate. Soaring columns of white marble banners of crimson and gold, and the 15 seats of the High Council arranged in a towering semicircle looking down upon the central podium. Ambassador Lorraine stood at the podium. She wore her formal diplomatic robes heavy with the medals of a lifetime of service. She felt very small in the massive room, but her posture was rigid, her chin held high. The chamber was in an uproar. "It is a fabrication," shouted Councillor Reck, a young fiery politician who had built his career on military expansion. "A mass hallucination, or perhaps the humans hacked your ship's sensors. A kinetic weapon punching through 3 shielded cruisers. It violates the laws of physics." "It violates our laws of physics, Counselor," Liren corrected, her voice cutting through the shouting. "The universe is under no obligation to obey Valaris textbooks." "You ask us to sign a treaty dictated by primitives," another counselor yelled. "You ask us to accept a border we cannot cross enforced by a fleet we cannot even see. It is capitulation. It is cowardice." "We must mobilize the Grand Fleet," Reck demanded, slamming his fist onto his desk. "We must launch a preemptive strike into this human space before they can build more of these illusionary dreadnoughts." Lyran let the shouting wash over her. She looked at the faces of the council. Most of them were young. They had inherited an empire built by the blood of their grandfathers, and they believed that inheritance made them invincible. They had never known true fear. They had never stood in the shadow of a monolithic black hull and waited for a 50-ton slug of tungsten to end their existence. "Silence," Liren said. She did not shout. She simply spoke the word with the absolute uncompromising weight of her 68 years. The chamber slowly quieted down. The counselors looked at the old woman standing at the podium. "You speak of mobilization." Liren said, her eyes sweeping across the semicircle of powerful men and women. "You speak of preemptive strikes. You speak with the arrogance of children who have never been hit back." She reached into her robes and pulled out the black data spool. She set it on the podium. "I was there, counselors. I watched Commander Vorgath, your greatest tactician, your most ruthless warrior, fall to his knees and beg for his life. I watched 50 of our finest warships rendered into floating scrap metal in less time than it takes to pour a glass of wine. And they did it without a single explosive. They did it with rocks thrown very, very fast." Liren gripped the edges of the podium. "They did not gloat. They did not demand tribute. They did not execute our sailors. They disabled our ships, and then they handed me a trade agreement." She pointed a trembling finger at Counselor Reck. "You want to mobilize the fleet, go ahead. But know this, they have been watching us for 200 years. They know the serial numbers on the engines of the ships you want to send. They know the names of the captains. They know the codes to our orbital defense grid. If we march to war, we will not be fighting a battle. We will be committing state-sanctioned suicide." The silence in the chamber was no longer angry. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of dawning realization. "They are not monsters," Liren concluded, her voice softening, carrying a profound sense of awe. "They are patient. They are disciplined. They are the silent guardians of the dark, and they are holding the door closed so we do not wander out into the night and hurt ourselves." Liren picked up the data spool. "I will sign this treaty. I will accept their terms. Because it is not a surrender, it is a gift, the gift of a future. I suggest this council accept it with gratitude and pray that we never give humanity a reason to change their minds." Lorraine turned and walked out of the High Council chambers. Her footsteps echoed against the marble, slow, deliberate, and final. She had brought them the coordinates of reality. Millions of light years away on the edge of a quiet, unassuming border, 47 black monoliths drifted in the void. They emitted no light. They made no sound. They simply waited, holding the line in the dark, watching over the younger races of the galaxy with the endless, terrifying patience of a species that had finally learned how to be still. The lesson was over. The watch had resumed.